and welcome back to AP World History Modern. Today we're going to begin our first day on Unit 8.4, the spread of communism after 1900. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the Communist Revolution in China, and our learning objective is to explain the causes and effects of movements to redistribute economic resources. So today we're going to look at basically the dynamics that existed in China up until 1949, and then we will kind of talk about the establishment of the People's Republic of China. And then the next video we'll look at, the People's Republic of China, right, the kind of post 49 years. All right, so here are our standards, right, from the College Board. All right, so I guess we are ending at this moment, right? So, we'll mostly end today at this moment. I guess I will kind of take us beyond 1949 a little bit here, and also kind of preview your next night's homework, or what we'll be looking at in your next video. Okay. All right, so the two sides of the Chinese Civil War, right? So if we're building up to eventually what becomes the People's Republic of China on October 1st, 1949, there's kind of two major forces at play. One is the Kuomintang or the Kuomintang. Sometimes I think your textbook spells this with a G, right? So it'd be a GMT. But this is the Nationalist Party, right? And of course, we often associate Chiang, Kai-shek, being the leader of this. So this is the party of Sun Yat-sen. Remember, the Qing dynasty collapses in 1911, and then Sun Yat-sen will arrive shortly thereafter into China. And there's a kind of a general connection between nationalist forces. Before we get into Chiang Kai-shek, Sun Yat-sen will become an ally during World War I. And generally speaking, they are pro-democracy, anti-communist, support free market economics, and generally aligned with the Allies, the British, the Americans, the French. Okay, and then of course we'll have the Chinese Communist Party under Mao. Right, so this is generally speaking, China should be communist. There should be nationalization of private property, redistributed, right, and generally supported by the peasants, and also during this time frame supported by the Soviets. Okay, and just like Kuomintang is spelt differently sometimes. Sometimes you'll see Mao Zedong spelt numerous ways, sometimes with a T as well. It's just different translations in English from Chinese. All right. So if we're talking about Mao and in the Civil War, we're talking about the spread of communism, from kind of Europe ideologically, and then the Soviet Union into Asia. And of course, China is simply one of many places in which we'll see China's communism or Marxism spread to. All right, so if you're talking about the Chinese Civil War, there's a couple of different things that we might be kind of talking about, depending upon what kind of depth you want to get into. So feel free to pause and read through this. I generally do not go through this in class. I kind of talk more broadly, simply pointing out that, when Chiang Kai-shek takes control for the first couple of years under Chiang, the Kuomintang, actively works with Mao and the CCP, and largely what they're doing is they are trying to reunify China, and in the kind of warlord sectionalization that had happened following the fall of the Qing dynasty, and once there is some success in that, there is some talk of kind of a two-party democracy. There is an air of cooperation that exists in the mid 1920s. However, by the time we get into like 1926 and then 1927, you're starting to see a very real fracturing of the relationship between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong. Chiang is being supported by the United States and the British and the French, and there's a kind of developing relationship there. And Mao is weary of that relationship. And you also see, the Soviet Union also establishing a relationship with Mao, during these years. And, we often kind of think about the Soviet Union and the United States and their kind of geopolitical maneuvering as part of the Cold War. So this is like a pre-Cold War example of this, where you kind of see, this kind of relationship building and whatnot between two different sides, right, within a country. And so that reality is going to strain the relationship between Mao and Chiang, and you're going to see a civil war break out. Violence will break out by the time we get into 1928, right? So this is the kind of first civil war. This civil war will largely wrap up by the time we get to 1935. Right, so 1934 is the beginning of what we call the Long March, and this is the kind of fifth major military campaign by Chiang Kai-shek to eradicate China of the CCP and Mao. So it generally kind of starts off here in the southeast of China, and then Mao and his forces will get pushed to the north, up into this kind of periphery or peripheral zone. Okay, and if you want some kind of just basic stats here, this so it begins in Southeast China, and Mao begins with 86,000 troops, right? So 86,000 troops, 35,000 of which were women, and they will walk over the course of just barely over a year, 6,000 miles, and this is the equivalent of walking from the east coast of the United States to the west coast and back again, plus a few hundred miles on top of that, right? So this is a massive distance that they walked, and of course they're walking over mountain ranges and across rivers. And at the end of the year, you've got about 10%, still alive. This is from a person looking at this from the outside, this is a horrific event, a devastating event for Mao, and one would think that everything would be done at this point. And had Chiang been able to kind of, fully consolidate power and have a few years to do so, then that probably would be the case, and Mao would be a footnote in history. However, things happened, and Chiang was not able to, fully consolidate power and have a few years of stability. Keep in mind, the Japanese had already invaded northern China in 1931, but the full-scale invasion of China happens by the Japanese. So World War II for the Chinese, officially begins in 1937, right? So, or 31, depending on how you want to count it. But by 1937, the full-scale invasion of China has started, right? And we see here there is a perspective from the CCP that the great, the Long March enables Mao to kind of consolidate power and become the clear leader of the CCP. So, and what we're seeing here, if you kind of look at this, after the Long March, 2 years later in 1937, I'm kind of looking at these stats down here. 2 years after the Long March, party membership really had not gone anywhere. It was stagnating. So they were at about 7,000 to 8,000 in 1935 when the Long March ended. A couple years later, they're up to 10,000. So there's really not much going on. There's no popular support being had or being created by Mao. But what happens next is when the Japanese invade in 1937, you're going to see party membership explode over 1 million by the time we get to 1945. Right, and so the Japanese invasion enables Mao to rebrand his movement, from a political reform socialist movement to a nationalist movement defending China from a foreign imperialist power of Japan, right? And that makes it a mass movement. So by the time we get to 1945, right, their numbers. Remember, there were 80,000 people. When the Long March began, right? Their numbers explode. Well more than 10 times. What they had when the Long March begins, and so kind of looking back on this, right? The Long March can be perceived from a communist Chinese perspective as a positive thing because, right, the people who are still part of the CCP after the Long March, they undeniably view Mao as their leader. And the people who are still with Mao after the Long March, Mao trusts them, right? They are undoubtedly followers of Mao and what Mao is talking about. And when this huge explosion in party membership takes place as a result of the Japanese invasion, Mao has a very sizable core who can deal with these new members and re-educate them. And right, there is a core around him that enables him to kind of focus on the big picture, and he can trust these 8,000 or so survivors, to run the show at the local level. Like, consider those 8,000 as like your officers in the military, they can then train and command the new enlistees. Right, so if you want to view the Long March from as a foundational thing for the Communist Party, that's generally how you'll hear it argued. Okay, all right. So so Maoism will develop right from the bottom up, and of course, it's these war years is where we kind of get the foundational beliefs of what Maoism really is, right? Kind of what Maoism truly is, and so when we talk about Maoism is an adaptation of Marxism. So just like Leninism, right? Lenin had to adapt Marxism to the conditions that existed in Russia, not a fully industrialized country. There's going to be some adaptations being made there. Adaptations have to be made in the case of China as well. I mean, China has very little industrialization, less so than Russia did. And so this is a peasant country. So when you talk about a peasant socialist revolution, this is generally what we'll call Maoism, or at least Mao adapts, the need for a proletariat as identified by Marx. He will replace the proletariat with the peasants, who are the ones that are involved in the class struggle. All right. So 2 policies will emerge as part of Maoism during these war years. One is these rectification campaigns, right? So this will provide cohesion within the party during its kind of explosive growth. So by the end of the year 1937, remember, they start the year 1937 with 10,000 members. They're already up to 40,000 by the end of that year, right? So after the the Japanese invasion, after the incidents of Nanjing, all right? By 1940, they're up to 800,000 members, and really at a kind of a practical limitation of what they could become. All right. And so by 1942, the party mission unification goals for its new members, because Mao is trying to deal with, these kind of massive influx of people, they come up with certain policies, right? And so the cadres and the intellectuals, people from the cities who have joined his movement, they're going to be sent off to the countryside to learn the peasant life, to understand the grievances of the peasant. So this becomes part of the, kind of the process of being a party member, is you need to go through rectification, right? So you need to change your way of viewing things and looking at things. You'll sometimes see this referred to as re-education, right? So these urban, intellectuals, cadre members, they need to be re-educated to understand the struggle of the peasant, right? So there's only one way to understand the struggle of the peasant, and that is to work as a peasant, right? Work in the fields, shovel the manure, wheelbarrow it. You need to go through rectification. And, sometimes you'll see this referred to as thought reform. brainwashing, depends on how you want to perceive this, right? Depending upon what your point of view is. And this really becomes a continuity during the Mao years. So we see this become kind of standard during the war years, and then once Mao establishes the People's Republic of China, you'll see these re-education movements and rectification as a pretty standard part of of the later Cultural Revolution. Deng Xiaoping was rectified on two separate occasions, right? So this is just is how it was, all right? And so it is definitely a continuity. Okay. All right. A second thing that we kind of see emerging here is kind of the meaning of art and literature was to serve the people, right? Peasants and the workers. Art should reflect the conscience of the masses, right? So when you think about people like Picasso and Guernica, something that we discussed earlier, this is, that is a classic example of bourgeois art. Especially if you start talking about surrealism and Dada. That is pure art for art's sake, right? And so under this, literature should be straightforward, easy to understand, right? Art should be straightforward, easy to understand. And this is really, if you want to make a comparison with this, under Stalin, we call this Soviet realism, right? So Soviet realism. So you'll look at a painting that was done during the Stalin years in the 30s. It'll be a group of men in a steel factory, a group of people in the fields working, for the greater good of the Soviet Union. Very straightforward, easy to understand, no interpretation required. It is being done to create nationalism, benefit the revolution, right? So we will see this as a kind of a central part of what happens during this era as well. All right, so anyway, the war years, I don't want to kind of get into this. We've already talked about World War II, right? So just understand that when World War II comes to an end, you've got parts of China that are largely, part of the resistance movement against the Japanese occupation that are under the control of Chiang Kai-shek, and you have parts under the control of Maoist forces, right? And of course, the Soviet army is already here, right? They'd already shifted their army from Europe, right? Which the peace in the VE Day is in May. They'd already shifted their forces to Asia, East Asia. And of course, the Americans are on the doorstep of Japan when the war ends. So when the war ends, you're going to see a logistical support being provided by the Soviets and the Americans, as well as weapons, military weapon support in arms, on both sides. There's a lot of leftover, and what are you going to do with them, right? So a lot of them will flood their way into China. As soon as World War II is done, you're going to see an outbreak of hostilities, right? Between the Civil War will light up again. Except this time, Mao had 80 to 90,000 troops. Now he's starting with over 1 million. Mao had limited weapons before. Now he has unlimited weapons, right? So what we're going to see is just a very bloody civil war between 1945 and 1949, right? And officially October 1st, 1949 is when the People's Republic of China will be declared, right? Very kind of famous moment with Mao and Tiananmen Square. No shortage of atrocities, right? And of course we're going to see Taiwan get created, or the Republic of China get created when the Kuomintang forces or the Kuomintang forces make their way to historic Formosa. Okay. All right. So People's Republic of China. If you're really looking for like a tipping point moment, in the Civil War, you could definitely make an argument that the economic crisis or the inflation crisis that happened in 1947 was a tipping point moment for Chiang Kai-shek. or to benefit the CCP. You have an economic crisis that happens throughout the year of 1947. This is going to result in the economy collapsing in China. Of course, with that economic collapse, political support for Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists are going to collapse as well. So the KMT is then going to be forced to flee. Right, they'll be forced to flee. And eventually you'll get Taiwan, and right, and then you'll see city after city falls in 49, and eventually you'll have the republic declared. Right, as far as Taiwan is concerned, the U.S. government will recognize Chiang as the kind of sole legitimate government for all of China, right? And but we generally say that we're not going to intervene. That being said, after the Korean War happens, as a way for the United States to prevent a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, the U.S. will send its 7th Fleet, into the Taiwanese Strait, and effectively blocking any attempt that Mao might have of using the Korean War as a pretext to go in and take over. All right, so Taiwan is created. It is supported by the United States, recognized by the United States right off the bat. And of course, from Taiwan, we get one of the kind of greatest imports into the United States. It's not this. It is General Tso's chicken. So I will, I guess, just because I am a huge fan of General Tso's chicken, I will share this video on my webpage with you. So, but yes, that is a great, a great Taiwanese export from the 50s. All right, but Taiwan today, right, or the Republic of China, it is definitely in the news. It's one of those things where the mainland, the People's Republic of China, generally does not recognize its existence. It claims that it is technically their island, identifying a historical claim to the land as theirs, kind of going back to the early Qing Dynasty years, and yeah, so this is kind of one of those historical what's going to happen with this. And will China eventually come and take it? And if China eventually does come and take it against their will, I guess the possibility is that they will want to be absorbed into China, and and there'll be a peaceful transition back. The status quo could be maintained, right, with a separate Taiwan and the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China. Or there's also the possibility that you might eventually someday have a Chinese, annexation of Taiwan and or the Republic of China, right? And of course, if that happens, then what happens next? How does the world react to that? Does the world react to that similar to how the world reacted to Crimea being annexed by Russia? Or does the world react, stronger than economic sanctions? So it's kind of one of those we will see, right? Right. As far as the kind of early years of China, right, kind of the beginning years of China, the Korean conflict is going to happen right after the formation of the People's Republic of China, right? So as far as the preconditions for the Korean War, just keep in mind, remember, after World War II is done, the peninsula gets carved into two parts: a communist north, right, and a free market south. And you're going to see a clear invasion in June of 1950 by the North. I have read that Stalin, Stalin was asked for permission to do this by the North Korean government, and Stalin denied that permission. And they went anyway and invaded, right? In response to this, you're going to see a United Nations coalition be formed. As the Soviet Union was boycotting the UN at this time, they did not invoke their veto right in the Security Council. So the United Nations will take advantage of that and form a coalition. largely led by the United States. Right, so that coalition force will then push up towards the Chinese border. The Chinese will tell the coalition forces to back away from their border. The UN forces do not, and then you're going to see a counter force being sent, almost pushing the UN forces off the peninsula completely, and basically pushing them down to this little teeny pocket. You'll see, the line held by the UN coalition forces. You'll see it reinforced, and then you'll see UN forces going around the backside and surrounding the Chinese forces, right? So it ends up being a very long and bloody war. They ended up, an armistice is signed, but no peace treaty. So technically, there's still a state of war on the Korean Peninsula. And when you start talking about death tolls, it's really, really, really kind of high numbers. U.S. loses 36,000 soldiers, 36,516 soldiers. South Korea loses 137,000 people. North Korea, right, somewhere in the neighborhood of 400,000. From the Chinese point of view, official numbers from China are 114,000. I've seen U.S. military estimates that 400,000 Chinese soldiers died in this. If you're talking about death toll from the Korean War, North Korean and Chinese, if you're using the Chinese numbers, 500,000 to 600,000. If you're using kind of the American counts, 800,000, right, died on that side alone. Very, very bloody war. And of course, as a result, we have this kind of Cold War relic here. The DMZ, the demilitarized zone. We've seen these kind of hard borders that were created during the Cold War, and of course, this is the original kind of Cold War proxy war. We've seen these kind of hard borders last for a long time. We've seen them collapse sometimes from clear statesmanship kind of being applied, sometimes by accidents. Of course, if you remember how the Berlin Wall comes down, it comes down because of a miscommunication, right, by an East German bureaucrat, resulting in a situation where teenagers holding guns at the border had to make a decision. And it's this wall might come down, or this DMZ might get washed away by something as arbitrary as that, or it may never go away, or it may take some kind of true statesmanship to eventually get rid of this. I personally thought there was a moment in 1990. In 2000. I remember watching the Sydney Olympic Games, right, as the kind of North Korean and South Korean Olympic teams walked into the stadium together. And there was like a moment where people were talking about maybe there'd be a unification of the Korean Peninsula. But we're now 20 plus years away from that, and nothing has happened, right? So, but yes, this is a Cold War relic, right, that is still around to this day. Right. So since we're kind of just talking, we're kind of dipping our feet into China, right? Once the People's Republic is created, your homework tonight is going to be, is going to be the Mao years, really, and a little bit beyond. And I always kind of like this quote when you're looking at Mao. So I think this is like a good little kind of preview. It's kind of good to know about this, I think, before your homework, right? So I always kind of like this quote. This is a quote from Chen Yun. I think it's from 1981. A committee was formed to kind of evaluate the Mao years, right? And just have a moment of reflection 5 years following his death, right? And I always kind of like this. I think this period, basically creates periodization for the Mao years, right? So had Mao died in 1956, his achievements would have been immortal, right? You kind of think about it. I mean, I've already kind of talked about the Korean War, right? Mao, as a 1-year-old country, goes head-to-head against the United States, the most formidable military on planet Earth at this time, and goes to a draw. I mean, from a Chinese point of view, I don't know how that can be seen as anything but, unbelievable that they were able to do that, right? So had he died in 56, his achievements would have been immortal, right? Head-to-head against Americans, went to a draw. Also a massive amount of reforms happened that were generally pretty popular up until 56, okay? And then, right, his achievements would have been immortal. Had he died in 66, he would have still been a great man, but flawed, right? So this tells you something happens between 1956 and 1966 that would have tarnished his reputation. He still would have been seen as a great man, but right, there are definitely some major chinks in the armor, and as you read about them, and as we talk about them in the next video, not that hard for someone to imagine that you might perceive it as a little bit more than just a few chinks in someone's armor, right? So, but he dies in 1976. Alas, what can one say? What the funny thing is when I kind of bring this up in class, almost everyone knows what happened between 1956 and 66. Very few kids generally know what happened between 66 and 76, but they really want to know what happened between 66 and 76, because, if what happens here, still would have him be viewed as a great man, what happened between here and here, right? All right. So this is, but I personally think this is kind of a good way to kind of break Mao down, right? Periodize his rule, right? So just to kind of give you a little bit of an idea, kind of a little bit of a preview. So Mao, and once you get past 1956, you're gonna get into the Great Leap Forward years, right? The Great Leap Forward years, and so this is the application of Stalinism, right? So Mao will adopt Stalinistic practices, 5-year plans, collectivization, industrialization. Right. So this is as Khrushchev is de-Stalinizing Russia, Mao is Stalinizing. Right. So this is going to be a big part of what happens. To tarnish the reputation, and so the Great Leap Forward, it's going to be a major push to increase agriculture output and industrial output. The effects of this are dramatically different, right? And if you're wondering what this the next phase is, from 66 to 76, this is the Cultural Revolution. And I'll be right back. 1 second. So there we go. So this is that kind of Cultural Revolution. And the Cultural Revolution is, probably the best way I've ever heard it described is it's a moral panic, right? It is a moral panic. And like many revolutions, it is a really good example of a revolution being turned on itself. And this is by design, right? This is Mao turning the revolution onto itself. And trying to get a new generation to experience what revolution is, right? So that they understand. So this is an interesting period. The death tolls are not nearly as high, but the kind of self-destruction of the state itself is, this has a very decentralizing effect on China. So this is the big moment. So as you're kind of doing your homework, right, make sure you're kind of focusing in on how this impacts, what the effects of this are going to be on China. All right, so let's do a little skill practice before we wrap up today. All right, so let's analyze the relationship between Chinese peasants and the Chinese Communist Party between 1925 and 1950. All right, so so if that were a prompt, here's a document. So let's come up with some sourcing, maybe situation or purpose, limitations. Just come up with some sourcing for this particular document. Right? If this is a document in a DBQ, with that prompt being analyze the relationships between the peasants and the Chinese Communist Party. All right, so go ahead and do that for a few minutes. Go ahead and pause it, and then I will give you some sample responses. All right, here we go. So, Mao's writing before a major revolution, and he wants to get peasant farmers on his side, something along those lines, all right? Or limitations. Source mainly trying to hype up Mao's side and deflate the opposition. However, we can still see the main goals of Mao and the communists are attempting to reach, and then go ahead and explain that. All right, so something to that effect. All right, that's about it for today. All right, and so let's just take a moment and go through the debrief and summary. The Soviet Union, right, was the first country to create a communist economy. Communism spread outside the Soviet Union and took root in China as well as other countries. The United States was trying to contain communism, right, not allowing it to spread. And then, kind of as you get into your homework, the Great Leap Forward, right, is going to be one of the kind of legacies of those Mao years, right? So mass murder was more clearly intentional on Mao's part. And we'll talk about this tomorrow. The Cultural Revolution was conceived, led, and directed by Chairman Mao. So that next phase, right? Why does Mao launch it? And we'll kind of get into this stuff tomorrow. This will make more sense on that debrief. All right, so that is it for today. Sabriati.